today got behind mail-in voting nationwide.
Briefing, of course, the president taking questions. Good evening, I'm Erin Burnett. That was President Trump giving the latest update on the pandemic. The president was very angry, if you were watching that over the past hour and a half or so, trying to rewrite history regarding his response to coronavirus. Coronavirus, as of today, has killed more than 23,000 Americans. I want to get straight to our panel who has been standing by as we all have been watching this. John King, let me start with you. The president was extremely angry and lashing out, frankly, multiple times at various reporters.
Erin, the briefing was breathtaking from beginning to when we dropped out, and at times it bordered on dangerous. The president began with a propaganda video. He played it in the room that cherry-picked moments. This was a Trump is awesome video, at taxpayer expense, played in the White House briefing room, that left out all of the statements. Look, the president has done some things right. We need context. We need nuance as we go through these things. But the president bristles at the suggestion he's done anything wrong, like say there will not be a pandemic. Anyone who needs a test can get a test. This is going to go away in April when it gets warm. I could go on. All that was left out. We got a Trump is awesome propaganda video. And then in the comment needs to read the Constitution of the United States of America. Even in a national emergency, the president's power is not, as he said, total. He said the president's authority is total. The president calls the shots. The president will tell the governors what to do. And he seemed to almost try to intimidate them by saying they need things from us. When I tell them to reopen the economy, they will do it. The governors don't see it that way. They want to work with the administration. They hope in 2 weeks, when the guidelines currently in place are up, things look a lot better and they can work this out. The vice president had a more nuanced approach. Some states are different. We'll work it out. But to have a president of the United States, after he runs a propaganda video in the White House briefing room, say my authority is total, the Constitution says otherwise.
All right, so my authority is total. The President of the United States calls the shots. He said it angrily. He said it curtly, Jim Acosta, and it does come right as he was, the question came to him. Look, you've got groups of governors in the West, groups of governors in the Northeast, right? Governors that represent, 60% of the people in this country who have been known to be infected, more than 60% of the people who have known to have died of this virus. So the president is obviously angry at that.
That's right, Erin, and I have to tell you, that is the biggest meltdown I have ever seen from a president of the United States in my career. I don't think a reasonable person could watch what we just saw over the last hour and conclude that the president is in control. He sounds like he is out of control, and he was ranting and raving for the better part of the last hour during that news conference. As John King was just saying, he's claiming that he has authorities that he doesn't have. The Constitution does not give the president of the United States total authority, and I thought it was very illuminating that Vice President Mike Pence got up there at the podium and described the president's authority as plenary or absolute. That is not the case. That is a fact check false. But getting to your question, Erin, I mean, I do think to some extent the president is realizing that the walls are closing in on him when it comes to managing this crisis. He ignored the severity of this crisis for a couple of months, and now he is trying to seize control over the situation as governors are going off on their own and coming up with their own plans. And one very important thing to keep in mind, Erin, throughout all of this, and that is one of the most trusted people in America right now, Dr. Anthony Fauci, despite the fact that he had to fall on his sword a little bit during that press briefing, he is talking to these governors individually. He is getting on the phone with these governors periodically from time to time and helping them formulate these reopening plans of their own. And so to some extent, top public health officials and governors are working around the president for precisely the reason that we just saw unfold in front of our very eyes over the last hour, and that is the president doesn't sound like he's in control on multiple levels, Erin.
And, of course, as you point out, Dr. Fauci did sort of fall on the sword. Obviously it said yesterday to Jake Tapper that had they started mitigation earlier, yes, it bears to fact that lives would have been saved. He made it clear today that when he and Dr. Birx first recommended to President Trump that he start these mitigation factors, that he listened and went ahead with it. So he made it clear, I believe, that if there is blame to be put, he shares some of that blame. It seemed that he was saying that. Brian Stelter, the president, though, there was one exchange he had with there were multiple, but one particularly stood out to me with a CBS News reporter where it was just denigrating and incredibly personal and frankly shocking even for a president who often does go after people asking questions.
Yeah, he still seems to prefer these small fights with the press instead of focusing on the virus. And that anti-media propaganda video is an example. He started this briefing with that anti-media propaganda video, which is nothing short of disgraceful. But it also shows us where he's coming from. He's focused on the past. He wasn't talking as much about the present or the future. Yeah, finally, later in the briefing, he eventually got around to talking about the government's response to the virus and what's happening now. But he was so focused on the past, Aaron, and I found myself thinking about the people in hospital wards who they don't want to talk about the past. They want to talk about right now. They need help right now. But the president is not showing empathy for those people. He is not showing compassion for the families that have lost loved ones. Instead, he's trying to play small ball. He's trying to fight against the media because that works for him. Culture war fights work for him. He knows how to do those. He's really good at those. But I think we have to keep focusing on the questions he's not answering about the lack of testing, the lack of a plan to get us out of this mess. That's what he doesn't want to talk about, and so he attacks the media instead. And I hope most people can see through it. You know, it's been 1 month, Aaron, since he said, I don't take any responsibility at all. And this was sort of a repeat of that.
Yeah. Daniel Dale, you've been going through and looking at the facts. What stands out to you? I know, of course, his claim of absolute authority in a federalist country where governors have constitutional rights to control their states has got to be near the top of the list.
That's number one for me. I mean, in addition to the obvious inaccuracy of any presidential claim to total authority, states in this area, in the area of public health, have a long established power to deal with emergencies in their states. The federal government does have some power as well, but it's simply not true that when it comes to emergencies, this is the president's deal alone. The president also repeated his claim that he banned travel from Europe and from China. Neither of those restriction policies are actual bans. Both contain many exemptions. In the case of Europe, Trump exempted entire European countries in addition to U.S. citizens, permanent residents, many of their family members. So that's not true. The president also claimed that you're not even hearing about ventilators anymore because everyone's so happy. Well, Maryland Republican Governor Larry Hogan was on ABC yesterday and said that's not accurate. And he said, quote, everybody still has tremendous needs on personal protective equipment and ventilators and all those things you keep hearing about. So it's not true that issue has gone away. And then fourth, Aaron, the president claimed that Joe Biden apologized for having called him xenophobic in the past. Biden has simply not issued any apology. That's imaginary.
No, certainly has not. So, you know, you bring up the China ban. I want to ask you about this, John King. When the president recommended, right, or as best he could, right, when he wanted to stop flights from China, that order came on January 31st. It was to take effect on February 2nd. And I want to make 2 points with that. First is that we didn't then have mitigation efforts until mid-March. So that would mean that if the president, like he was saying, saw this when no one else saw it, when Dr. Fauci wasn't recommending those moves and the WHO wasn't recommending those moves, but he alone saw what a disaster this was going to be, so he ordered that flight ban. If that was the case, he would have not only done the mitigation efforts sooner, presumably, right, but one would presume tests would have been fired up and PPE would have been ordered and check-ins with governors on what they needed and ventilators, but none of that happened. Meaning his claim that this ban on China flights that he suggested, you know, indicated, you know, his clairvoyance on this, it just doesn't add up.
The other pieces don't add up. Again, the president was roundly criticized. One of the reasons he was so angry today is because he believes he did the right thing with the China ban, and it wasn't a total ban. Daniel has laid this out there, but It was severe restrictions on travel from China, and the president believes, and the public health experts now agree, that it helped, that it likely helped the spread of the disease here in the United States, and he bristles that I did that. Give me credit for that. Stop analyzing everything else I did. You make an incredibly key point. Look, Dr. Fauci got up, and as he fell on the sword, as Jim put it, rightly so, tried to say, look, there was a debate among the public health professionals about mitigation. Do you take such a dramatic step when the case numbers were so low? So that was a debate. We'll see how it plays out. The president did, though, at that moment, as that debate was starting to boil, put the vice president in charge, shake up the task force, put the vice president in charge, silence the people he viewed as alarmists who are out there saying this is going to spread and it's going to spread fast, and consolidated the messaging of the group. That is a simple fact. But to your other point, which is more critical, at the end of the Obama administration, let's say the shelves were empty. Let's say the shelves were empty, okay? The Obama administration officials dispute that. They do say they had some disasters late in their tenure, and they also had the sequester, the Budget Act, that prevented them from refilling it. But just assume, for the sake of argument, they were empty. He's been president for 38 months at that point, number one. Number two, he always says Obama didn't leave him a good test. The novel coronavirus popped up in China in 2019. President Obama was gone, long gone. There was no way the Obama administration could have had a test for the novel coronavirus that came up in the Trump administration. And the administration, their first test was bad, and they've just simply had a lot of problems here. Now, we would give them some grace if they would say we're having a lot of problems here. This is new. We're trying to ramp up, and it's difficult. The president keeps saying we have all the testing we need. They just today announced a deal to get 750,000 more from South Korea. If we had all the testing we need, why are we buying them from another country?
And these are crucial points. And then, Jim Acosta, as you've been in so many of these briefings, you also, again, to this key point the president's making, right, in his whole propaganda video, which is, I banned these flights from China, so I saw what no one else saw. I was right. I got it right. Not only, of course, does his actions after that show that to be untrue, but his words after that show that to be untrue. I mean, here he is on February 10th,
Totally.
February 25th, and February 26th. So again, these are all weeks and then up to a month after this ban on China flights, which he said was a sign of his clairvoyance. Here's what he was saying about the coronavirus.
Looks like by April, in theory, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away.
You may ask about the coronavirus, which is, very well under control in our country.
We have it so well under control. I mean, we really have done a very good job.
So that's what he was saying,
Right.
day after day after day, week after
That's
week
right.
after week.
That's right, Aaron. And, the president was trying to argue his way out of the Fauci controversy by saying, well, when Dr. Fauci was telling us to start social mitigation, that's when we started it. But that totally avoids the point that you're making, Aaron, and that is for the better part of a month and a half, the president was downplaying the severity of this virus. He was describing it as something like the seasonal flu when it's not. He was saying it would go away like a miracle. It has not gone away. He was saying that it would go away in April when it got warmer outside. That has not been the case as well. He has also said that his administration had things under control. As John King was just saying a few moments ago, he's been in office for 38 months now. He's had plenty of time to restock the shelves. And we should point out, numerous fact-checking organizations have pointed out that is just false. When the president says, I inherited an empty shelf, empty cupboards, that is false. There were supplies in the national stockpile when the Trump administration came into office. That is just a flat-out lie that he repeats over and over again, and it goes to this problem that he's having. He's trying to talk his way out of a mess that he created himself when, over the past 45 to 60 days, both he and members of the conservative media were in this echo chamber saying to one another that the public did not have to worry about this, when clearly his own administration should have been preparing for the pandemic that unfolded, perhaps not to the severity that we're seeing right now, but obviously they had time to get ready. The president had time to get the public ready. Remember, there were red states that were very late to issuing their own stay-at-home orders, their own stay-at-home guidance. That was because, in part, they were listening to the president. They were listening to the man that they put above almost everything else in politics these days, arguably above everything else in politics these days, and it cost the American people precious time. And I just don't think there's any way to avoid that. The president is trying to delete days and days of footage that just are never going to go away. And the public is going to be reminded of this from here until the end of the year. Aaron, part of the problem, I think, is that the president has a temperament issue. And you and I have seen this since the 2016 campaign. Jeb Bush described him as the chaos candidate. He became the chaos president, but what the American people want right now, and they're not getting, is a coronavirus president, and a chaos president just isn't fitting the bill.
All right. Thank you all very much. We do now have calling in on the phone here the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, and I wanted to give you a chance, Governor, to respond. I know you're obviously, I saw your press conference today with several other governors as you're trying to coordinate your plan for reopening and dealing with the coronavirus. Don't know if you just heard everything the president said, but there were a couple of moments when he took this on. He specifically said the president of the United States calls the shots, and he has total authority to decide to open New York or any other state. Do you agree?
Well, I don't agree, Aaron. Thank you for having me, by the way. I don't agree with the president's legal analysis. The president doesn't have total authority. We have a constitution. We don't have a king. We have an elected president. That's what our founding fathers did when they wrote the Constitution. And the Constitution clearly says the powers that are not specifically listed for the federal government are reserved to the states. And the balance between federal and state authority was central to the Constitution. It's one of the great balances of power. And the Constitution has served this nation very well for a long time. And again, they didn't want a king. Otherwise, we would have had King George Washington. We didn't. We had President George Washington, elected by the people. Having said that, the president also said that the CDC was going to issue guidelines. Now, guidelines are not mandates. Guidelines are what they did on closing down the economy. Remember, the federal government did not close down the economy. The president's right. He did a travel ban with China. That was not closing down the economy. Closing down the economy is what the states did at different times in different ways. The CDC issued guidelines. Most states went well beyond the CDC guidelines, and guidelines are just guidelines, right? Guidelines are do this if you like. But it's not a coordinated national approach, and it's clearly not the federal government enacting it. So the two are in either you're doing a federal takeover or you're doing guidelines which the states can follow if they want to follow. You know, he seemed to be saying both, so I don't really know.
So when the vice president said, well, you know, because they asked him, do you believe this holds up constitutionally, right? The president's point that only he and only he can call the shots for the states. Pence said that yes, he believes that's true because of this national emergency declaration situation that we're under. Does that hold any water with you, Governor Cuomo?
Legally, no. You don't become king because there's a national emergency. Now, you could argue that a federal government has enhanced power because of a federal emergency. But again, Aaron, that's not what they did. The tough decisions were the closing down of the economy. This reopening is more of an artful, science-based process, but the closing down, which is where the president could have exercised this theory of total control, he didn't do it. He left it all to the states, and we had this whole hodgepodge of actions over a period of time. I think, frankly, if we had a clearer national direction earlier on, we probably would have had a more orderly shutdown. But no, even in a federal emergency, it doesn't abrogate the Constitution. And that's what you would have to say here. The Constitution of the United States goes out the window because we have a federal emergency. And that is not, it's not the law of the land, period.
So what are you prepared to do if he comes out with, and you know, he refused to give a date today, but a much more aggressive opening, right? I know today at your press conference, you laid out, for example, how you wanted to work with nearby states on, well, one wants to open the bars and the other doesn't, and you were going to work together. But if the President of the United States comes out and lays out a plan that you think is not responsible and not right for New York, would you tell New Yorkers to ignore what he is saying and overrule it and say, no, listen to me, as the governor, this is what we will do?
Oh, look, if they came out with hypothetical, if the president came out with a plan that I believed was irresponsible and could jeopardize the public health of the people of the state of New York, I would oppose it legally, period. The coalition we put together is not all Democrats. You know, I know the Washington way is to quietly...
Yeah, he just said that, yeah.
Yeah, that's not true. The state of Massachusetts, last time I checked, they have a great governor in Massachusetts, Governor Baker, who happens to be a Republican. So it's not partisan. It's not politics. We've all stayed away from that. The president should stay away from that. Don't start that divisiveness with the partisanship. That would do himself a disservice, right? He likes to say, I worked with Democratic governors, Republican governors. Even his own video, it said bipartisan, Democrat, Republican. Well, yeah, keep it there and don't get partisan. And look, the governors would like nothing more than an engaged federal government where we know what the federal government does and what the states do. But then, by the way, the federal government has to do its role, too. And on this issue of testing, I'm telling you, that's going to become a major issue. The states do not have the capacity to do large-scale tests. You can't get large-scale diagnostic tests, and that's going to be a key to any reopening plan.
So he also said, that he sent the ship here to New York Harbor, and he said that he did everything you wanted with Javits Center, but the reason that he was bringing those things up was to show that he'd worked with you, given you what you wanted, but you didn't need it. His words, I believe, are the Javits Center is empty. Now, that's not obviously quite true, but what's your response to him on that? It's pretty clear he's saying asked for things that he believes you do not need.
Yeah. Look, facts matter, okay? And I don't even think the president should be defensive on this. The truth is the CDC's original estimate was in the millions of people infected. The CDC, that's him. The White House Coronavirus Task Force said in the millions of people. That's him. That did not come to be. But as a governor, you prepare for the worst, hope for the best. If you read the CDC guidelines, if you read the White House Coronavirus Task Force, in the state of New York, you could need over 100,000 beds. Those were also the projections of the organization funded by Gates and Cornell University and Columbia University and McKinsey. They were all projecting in the state of New York up to 140,000 beds needed. We only have 50,000 beds. So yes, to prepare for the numbers that both the federal government and the experts said it could be, we needed additional beds. And the president's also right that the Army Corps of Engineers did a great job in building emergency facilities. And I did call him and ask him for expedited assistance with the Army Corps of Engineers, and he did provide it. He shouldn't be defensive about that. And the government initiatives and policies did reduce the number of people infected. Caveat, so far. We just have to make sure we don't go backwards. So he's right there, and he did work cooperatively with this state and other states, and that's why I don't understand why you would pivot at this point to this aggressive, hostile suggestion of total authority of the federal government and abandon the partnership cooperation that he started by praising.
All right, Governor Cuomo, I appreciate your time. Good to talk to you again. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Erin.
All right, thank you, Governor. And I want to go now straight to Dr. Sanjay Gupta. So Sanjay, when you hear all this, I guess let's just start with the president says he was right on everything, right? He always points to that China ban, which of course he did do, but then obviously he followed up with nothing that would indicate that he did that because he was worried about a pandemic killing hundreds of thousands of Americans, right? Nothing that he did in a month and a half after that really seemed to back that up at all. So when he says he was early on everything, ahead of, the health officials, do you agree?
Well, no, I think that the buying of time, I think one of the reporters asked that question. I think the idea of the travel ban, I think made a lot of sense, and I think it was probably a tough decision at that time. The idea was the idea was never that this virus is not going to come to the United States. We knew it was going to come. I mean, it's a virus. It's going to travel across borders, and we knew that was going to happen. The question was, as Governor Cuomo was just saying, there was projections at that point as to how many hospital beds, how many ventilators, how many ICU beds, all that would be necessary. Erin, let me show you a timeline that I put together sort of over the weekend to sort of make this point. And as you look at this timeline, one thing to keep in mind is that as more information is gathered about this virus in terms of how it's behaving, it does continue to raise additional levels of concern. So on January 7th, they confirmed that there is a novel coronavirus. That's a concern because this is a virus the world hasn't seen before in human beings. We don't know exactly what's going to be how it's going to behave. If you sort of go through that calendar, you realize that on January 31st, you go to the end of that month, and what you realize is that we now have evidence of human-to-human transmission in the United States. That's a significant point there. If you have human-to-human transmission, that has raised the level of concern, right? And if you go a couple of weeks after that, Erin, you find that you have evidence for sure of asymptomatic spread in the United States. Now, why do I present it like that? Because it's not to say that from the very beginning it was the same level of concern as a week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later. As you got more information, the level of concern went up. Keep in mind, Erin, that SARS was also a novel coronavirus at that time, 2003. And I think a lot of people were asking, is this going to be more like SARS, which ultimately infected 8,000 people in the entire world and 800 people died in the entire world, right? Was it going to be like H1N1, which infected 60 million people in the United States, but had a very low fatality rate? We didn't know, is the point. But once you found that there was human-to-human transmission, once you found there was asymptomatic transmission, I think what surprised me was that things weren't done more aggressively at that point. Maybe not at the beginning of January, because we're still trying to figure it out. How's this new virus really going to behave? But as more information came in, I think, as we've talked about, Aaron, for a couple months now on this program, I've been surprised all along. Why aren't we talking about ventilators now? Why aren't we talking about ICU beds? Not middle of March, but middle of February, or even beginning of February.
So, you know, in the context of this, and obviously now this big debate between the president and the governors, right? The governor's obviously taking charge today, groups on the West Coast, groups on the East Coast and the Northeast, in terms of what they're going to do, how they're going to respond, and how they may reopen. There was a model that came out today, and I know we have made the point, Sanjay, again and again, that models are only as good as the inputs that go into them. But the Los Angeles County has put out a new model. Their calculations are, if you lift the stay-at-home order right now, 95% of the county will get infected, and we can all imagine how gruesome and horrific that would be. But this is the crucial follow point. If the guidelines stay in effect, still 30% of people will be affected. Stronger measures could drop that number to 5%. The reason I raise this and want to get your point of view on it is that the numbers that we've seen worldwide in terms of how many people they believe have been exposed are all really below 5%, except for in Spain and Italy, where it may be 10, maybe 15. That is with the mitigation that we've been doing so far.
That's right.
So they're saying that if they continue to do the mitigation we're doing so far, and they don't even put an end point on it, that you could still end up with 30% of the people affected just by the amount of commerce and interaction that's happening right now. That is pretty stunning and frankly incredibly frightening.
It is frightening, and it's a reminder, Aaron, that no matter what, this is still a very contagious virus. The physiology, the pathology of the virus, that doesn't change based on these social distancing stay-at-home measures. The stay-at-home measures influence how easily the virus can spread from person to person because we're simply not in close proximity. But it's still a very contagious virus. And I think that somebody said to me over the weekend, Aaron, it looks like the risk now to any given individual in the United States sick from it. That's true because we have these measures in place, Aaron. So I think that that's a really important point. Once we relax these measures, and I don't say this in any way, you know, to frighten people, but once we relax these measures, there will be people who become infected who otherwise would not have become infected. There will be people who get very sick who otherwise would not have become sick. That is true because that is the nature of the virus. Until we have a vaccine, we can't promise that people aren't going to get sick. So there's going to be at some point there's going to be this inflection point. Okay, we are willing to tolerate a certain number of illnesses and infections in order to reopen the economy. If you ask the University of Washington folks and you look at their models, they'll say that number's 0.03%. It's a bit of a made-up number, but that means 90 people a day will still be dying of this virus at the time that the economy, as the nation would start to reopen. This is sort of the situation that we're in. And as you mentioned at the beginning, there's still models. All models are wrong, but some are useful, and some are instructive, like this one.
All right. Thank you very much. And it certainly makes us all think long and hard about what life will be like here over perhaps some very extended period of time, when we talk about normal and what normal means.
Right.
All right, Sanjay, thank you very much. And also in tonight's briefing, we mentioned Dr. Anthony Fauci was there, and he did walk back remarks that he made here on CNN. So what he said was that more could have been done in February to prevent the spread of coronavirus. And he told our Jake Tapper that, quote, there was a lot of pushback at the time. Now, some people implied that pushback to perhaps have come from the president, as Fauci admitted that had they put these mitigation efforts into effect weeks earlier, many lives would have been saved. Well, tonight at the briefing with the president, Fauci clarified his remarks. Here's what he said.
And that was the wrong choice of words. You know what it was? When people discuss, not necessarily in front of the president, when people discuss, they say, well, this is going to happen, that. So it was a poor choice of words. There wasn't anybody saying, no, you shouldn't do that.
Are you doing this voluntarily, or did the
No,
president?
I'm doing it. Everything I do is voluntarily. Please, don't even imply that.
Hot front now, Dr. Jonathan Reiner. He advised the George W. Bush White House medical team for 8 years, and he's currently the director of the cardiac catheterization program at George Washington University Hospital. Dr. Reiner, what's your reaction to Dr. Fauci, walking back, clarifying those remarks? I interpreted it as him saying, yeah, there were obviously mistakes made. They wish they'd done it earlier, but he made it clear that that finger should be pointed at multiple people. He didn't point it at the president directly.
Well, Dr. Fauci yesterday spoke the truth. When asked whether earlier mitigation efforts would have resulted in more lives saved, he responded the only way he could, which was to say, sure. If we had closed down elements of our economy and got people to social distance sooner, the virus would have not spread as widely. So that's absolutely true. But the broader truth is that multiple mistakes were made very early on. And I put them into three categories. Number one, the time that we gained, whatever time we gained from the China ban, was wasted in our very, very slow efforts to widely test.
And again, we're working very closely with the president and outside business leaders to develop a plan.
I just wonder, I'd like to ask Mr. President, what you think, if you could sketch for us what reopening the economy looks like. Do you think it's going to be everything open, or do you think...
We'll be doing that over the next 2 days because we'll probably be making a statement about that and exactly what it looks like. I know what that looks like, but I also want to get the advice, in a sense. We have some of the biggest from every business on this council. We're actually setting up a number of different councils or committees, I guess you could call them. And we have a lot of smart people. I think that they will give us some also good advice. But no, we want to be very, very safe. At the same time, we got to get our country open.
Yeah, and I understand that, Mr. President. Do you think there is a possibility then that what you do is you open it incrementally? Do you think people will go back to restaurants, to concerts, the cinema?
I do think so. Eventually they will, yeah.
And let me ask one.
I think eventually they will do that. And I think we're going to, boom, I think it's going to go quickly. Our people want to get back to work, and I think there's a pent-up demand like there hasn't been in a long time. And that's why you see the stock market. I mean, to think that the stock market's at the level it is right now with all that this world and this country has gone. And look at the European Union, how badly decimated they've been. Look at other countries. Look at China, by the way. I've seen the numbers. Look at China. Look at how these countries have been just decimated by this. And to think that the stock market is at this tremendously high number, not that much, it was looking a little bleak for a while, but it hit a certain point and then started going up. I think that's a great tribute to the fact that there's a demand. Yeah.
Mr. President, thank you, sir. In regards to some of your tweets earlier today, and I think it was Steve's question, my question to you is what provision in the Constitution gives the president the power to open or close state economies? And then
numerous provisions. We'll give you a legal brief if you want.
And then we'll be looking forward to that, sir. But following up, what happens if you say, for instance, we want states to reopen, but California or New York do not open? What would you do then?
I think everybody wants to open. I mean.
So can I just ask one other thing on
that could happen, but I don't think that would happen.
It's been states that have closed, ordered schools closed. It's been states that have ordered businesses like restaurants.
That's because I let that happen. Because I would have preferred that. I let that happen. But if I wanted to, I could have closed it up. But I let that happen. And I like the way they've done it. And the 7 that remained really in sort of a semi-lockdown, if you look at those states, they've really done a very good job. They're very much different from a New York or from other places where they've been hit very hard.
So you're prepared to pick on states and say, I order you to open your schools, I order you to force kids to be able to go?
Yes, Mr. President. Following up on that, there are 2 consortiums of states today, California, Oregon, Washington on the West Coast, northeastern states, totally representing about 100 million people, who said they're going to cooperate and decide when to reopen.
Well, they can decide, but...
Does that undermine what you're trying to do?
No, not at all. Let me just tell you, very simple. I'm going to put it very simply. The President of the United States has the authority to do what the President has the authority to do, which is very powerful. The President of the United States calls the shots. If we weren't here for the states, you would have had a problem in this country like you've never seen before. We were here to back them up, and we've more than backed them up. We did a job that nobody ever thought was possible. It's a decision for the President of the United States. Now, with that being said, we're going to work with the states because it's very important. You have local governments. They're pinpointed. It's really, you talk about, it's like a microchip. They're pinpointed. We have local government that hopefully will do a good job. And if they don't do a good job, I'd step in so fast. But no, they can't do anything without the approval of the President of the United States. Go ahead, please.
So if some states refuse to reopen and you order them to, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution says all powers that don't reside in the President or the Congress reside in the states. How do you overcome that?
Well, if some states refuse to open, I would like to see that person run for election. They're going to open. They're going to all open.
The ballot box.
I think that's something that's not going to happen. They want to open. They have to open. They have to get open. Every one of those states, the people want to go and they want to. Now, some are in a different situation. You have, I won't name states now, but I will over the next 2 or 3 days. I'm going to be very specific. But you have some states where this is not the kind of a problem that it is in New York or Louisiana or Michigan or other places that got hit very hard. Illinois got hit very hard. But all states want to open, and they want to open as soon as possible, but they want to open safely, and so do I. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today, the French President Emmanuel Macron said that he will keep the shutdown in France till the middle of May. Does that mean that the U.S. will keep the ban
No,
on
France
flights
got hit
from
very
Europe?
hard. France got hit very hard, and again, he has to do what he has to do. He's a friend of mine. But France, Spain has just been decimated. You look at what's happened in Italy, it's a very well-known fact, what happened in Italy. No, they were hit very hard.
Question for Secretary Mnuchin. Has everybody that you would like to have, the 100 business people on the Economic Council, have they all been invited already? Have they all agreed to
They haven't been invited yet. We just reviewed the names with the president today.
And are they from all sectors?
Yes,
Energy?
there's verticals. So every single area of the economy we wanted to be represented.
Great. One other thing, is there anything else needs to be done to work on industry, oil industry jobs, to save oil industry jobs after the deal this past weekend?
Well, I think there's always things. So we're working with Larry Kudlow. I mean, we have economic plans for every single part of the economy. Obviously, in the case of the oil industry, they've been hit especially hard because you've had both the supply issue and you've had the demand issue.
Have you figured out the bailout money for the airlines, what the allocations for the airlines?
So I'm pleased to say we've worked very hard. I think, as you probably have seen, we put out a press release that we have now had discussions with almost all the airlines. I've personally had discussions with all the major airline CEOs. We specifically created an exception for small airlines that we could process very quickly, and I think you'll see very quickly decisions coming out. I'm very pleased with the discussions we've had.
We've had very good discussions.
Secretary,
Yes.
do you foresee a need for a phase 4 stimulus, or is this
Steve, I
push
just want to
through
say
the
we have
economy
had
in lieu of
discussion.
that?
Wait, excuse me 1 second. We've had very good discussions with the airlines. Very good discussions.
Is it possible to reopen the economy on May the 1st?
I don't want to say that. You'll be hearing over the next few days.
Phase 4 stimulus,
Let me just
do you
comment.
still
I'm gonna answer
see a
your
need for a
question.
phase 4? Is this push in lieu of another stimulus?
Okay, so again, let me just comment. I mean, Congress on a bipartisan basis approved an unprecedented amount of money to help American workers and American business because it was no fault of their own that business was closed down. We have been very diligently executing on that. You know, everybody said it was going to take months to get people money. We are executing very quickly. We created a whole new SBA program in a week. Our job right now is to execute the $2.3 billion, which we can add several $1 trillion with the Fed. The one area we are particularly concerned about is the small business program. Quite frankly, it's even more incredibly popular and successful than we anticipated. So the president wants to be very clear we have money for that. And once we get done with that, we will review with the president. If there is more money that needs to be to support this economy, to support hardworking Americans, we will work with Congress to get that
And
done.
Steve, do you want to talk about phase 4?
So phase 4, the president has talked about infrastructure for a long period of time. We've talked about, to the extent that the hospitals need more money because of the medical issues, we'll monitor that. We want to make sure there are incentives for restaurants, entertainment, people to get back to those types of things. So we'll be looking at very specifically provisions to stimulate parts of the economy. Some of them may be money issues, some of them may be regulatory issues.
Mr. President.
Just to clarify your understanding of your authority vis-a-vis governors, just to be very specific. For instance, if a governor issued a stay-at-home
When you
order,
say my authority, the president's authority, not mine, because it's not me. This is, when somebody's the president of the United States, the authority is total. And that's the way it's got to be.
your authority is total.
It's total. It's total.
Your authority
And the
is
governors
total.
know that.
So if a
The governors know that. Now, you have a couple of bands of excuse me. You have a couple.
Could you rescind that order?
You have a couple of bands of Democrat governors, but they will agree to it. They will agree to it. But the authority of the President of the United States having to do with the subject we're talking about is total.
Mr. Vice President, do you agree with that?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
The President's authority is total.
Go ahead, please.
One of the things we saw in your video about was the travel ban from Europe. As part of reopening America, do you want to reopen the borders so that people from Europe, from the UK,
At the right time. A very good question, actually. Well, I'm going to have to take a look. I wouldn't say Italy's doing great right now, and I wouldn't say Spain's doing great right now. And we just heard that France is extending its stay-inside order, right? They've extended it. I just see that, and I think for a short period of time. But no, when they're back, we want to do it very quickly, but we want to make sure everything's good. No, right now we have a very strong ban. We're going to keep it that way until they heal.
Weeks, months? What would you?
Well, I can't tell you that. I have to see how they're doing. I mean, France just went for another 2 days, for another 2 weeks. We have to see, John.
So Dr. Fauci said that you took his advice on the question of mitigation.
Man, I don't know.
The social distancing I'm talking about, the shutting down,
Okay.
not of travel, but of activity. So my question is, as you make this next decision, which you have said may be the most difficult or important decision of your presidency, will you assure the American people that you will again take the advice of the doctors, of Dr. Fauci, of Dr. Birx? Will you take the advice of the health experts before you
I
do
will,
that?
and many other people also. But I will absolutely take their advice.
Well, would you go
Please,
against
ahead.
their? Would you go against their recommendation if they say you need another 15 or 30
I don't
days?
think it would be likely because I think we're not very far from being on the same page. Please.
Yes, Mr. President, one thing that Governor Cuomo said today is that states do not have the capacity to do mass COVID-19 testing ahead of a reopening.
Well,
as
they have to do it. Look,
he
they're
says he
supposed to
can't
be doing
purchase
it.
the diagnostic tests or equipment and needs federal help.
Well,
So will the
they may
states
need
get
help,
that?
but
Will they get it?
But they're there. They're on ground. They've got local mayors, local representatives. They have people that do it.
Supplies.
And what we did last time is unprecedented. We literally rebuilt tests. We rebuilt a whole industry because we inherited nothing. What we inherited from the previous administration was totally broken, which somebody should eventually say. Not only were the cupboards bare, as I say, but we inherited broken testing. Now we have great testing. I just left the top executives at Abbott. Who would have thought that would have happened, where they have such a great test as that? And in fact, what I'll do, I think, unless you have any further questions for the Secretary of the Treasury, do you have anybody for Steve? Anybody? Is that for the Secretary of the Treasury or for me? Because if it's for me, we can wait.
For Secretary.
We have to get him back to work, okay?
Yes, sir. For Secretary Mnuchin, a question from one of my colleagues who's not able to be in the room. They're curious about the SBA rule that prevents small casinos from getting some of this relief. Is that something that you're taking a look at? Is there going to be a change to?
So not small casinos, but there are such things as small taverns and restaurants that have literally, small gaming things, and we are coming out with some additional guidance on that. But I want to be clear, it's not small casinos.
Thanks, sir.
Secretary Mnuchin?
Secretary,
Yes.
there was a letter that some House Republicans sent this weekend about liquidity for mortgage servicers.
Yes.
Can you explain what you're looking at on that front?
Sure. So I think I commented on this a week or so ago. We had a subcommittee task force at EVSOC that specifically studied this issue. We have all the appropriate people on it. Ginnie Mae has automatically taken some action. We've had conversations with the FHFA as to what they're going to do for Fannie and Freddie. And we've said that to the extent they need certain authorities from the Treasury, we will accommodate that. So we're very aware of the issue. Quite frankly, we'd been studying this issue way before COVID and had concerns about some of these non-bank servicers not being well capitalized, but we're going to make sure that the market functions properly.
Thank you, sir. We have seen in a number of these relief bills that Democrats and Republicans have been able to push forward different non-coronavirus specific funding priorities. Are you trying to keep funding specific to coronavirus? And then if there are going to be other additions, for instance, a change to labor rules is something that many on the left wanted. Some on the right are wondering if they should also, if you should also be pushing for, their preferred add-ons.
Well, I think our expectation has always been this is COVID related. Some people have a rather broad view of what COVID related is because it has impacted almost every single business.